Snoop Dogg wasn't looking to make headlines that day. He was just grabbing a few things from the corner store, trying to keep it low-key in his usual laid-back way. The sun was shining, his headphones were bumping, and life was good. But as he stood in line, waiting to check out, he noticed a little girl up ahead. She couldn't have been more than 10, her tiny hands clutching a small bag of groceries, just the basics: bread, milk, a couple of cans of soup. But when the cashier rang it up, the girl's face fell. She was short on cash. Snoop watched as she nervously fumbled through her pockets, her voice barely above a whisper as she apologized. The people behind her shifted impatiently, but Snoop saw something they didn't: the worry in her eyes, the kind that didn't come from missing out on a snack, but from something deeper. He didn't know the full story yet, but he knew enough. And Snoop wasn't about to just stand there and watch. The sun was dipping low over Long Beach, casting a warm orange hue across the streets. Snoop Dogg, dressed in his usual laid-back style, a loose hoodie, some clean sneakers, and his signature shades, was making his way down to the corner store. His headphones pumped out smooth beats as he nodded to a few familiar faces along the way, keeping it cool and casual like he always did. It was supposed to be just another quick stop. Grab a few snacks, maybe some milk for his cereal, and bounce. But fate had a different plan. As Snoop pushed the door open, the familiar ding of the bell echoed through the small shop. The place smelled like old wood and fresh bread, the kind of neighborhood store where everyone knew everyone, or at least, they thought they did. Snoop grabbed what he needed and strolled up to the counter, but as he stood there, waiting for the line to move, something caught his eye. A little girl, no older than 10, was standing at the front, her tiny hands clutching a bag of basic groceries: bread, milk, and a couple of cans of soup. Her clothes were clean but worn, and her sneakers had seen better days. The cashier rang up the items, but when he told her the total, she froze. Snoop watched closely. The corner store wasn't anything special. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow over the worn linoleum floors that had seen better days. The shelves were packed tightly with everything from canned soup to cereal boxes, the kind of place where you could find a little bit of everything. The air smelled faintly of old bread and floor cleaner, and a small fan near the counter hummed lazily, doing its best to push around the stale air. But despite the ordinary setting, something about the scene unfolding at the front of the line made Snoop pause. The little girl stood there, her back to him, but he could see the tension in her small frame. She wasn't just waiting to pay, she was hoping she could. Her tiny hands clutched a plastic bag filled with the most basic groceries: a loaf of bread, a small carton of milk, and 2 cans of soup. It wasn't much, but from the way she held onto it, you'd think it was everything in the world. Snoop could tell right away, this wasn't about snacks or treats. This was about need. When the cashier, a middle-aged man with a bored expression and a name tag that read Ron, rang up the items, the total flashed on the small screen with a soft beep. $5.83, Ron announced, his tone flat and uninterested, like he'd said it 1,000 times before. The girl's shoulders tensed. She dug into the pockets of her faded jeans, pulling out a handful of crumpled dollar bills and a few coins. Her small fingers moved quickly, counting and recounting, as if hoping the numbers would magically change. But they didn't. Her breathing quickened, and Snoop could see the flush rising in her cheeks, the telltale sign of embarrassment creeping in. She glanced up at the cashier, her voice barely a whisper. I don't think I have enough." The store, which had been filled with the quiet hum of refrigerators and the occasional beep of scanned items, suddenly felt too quiet. The people in line behind her shifted uncomfortably. A woman in a business suit sighed loudly, glancing at her watch like this delay was a personal inconvenience. A young man scrolling on his phone barely looked up, but took a small step forward, eager to get this over with. But Snoop didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the little girl, his mind already working through what was happening. This wasn't just a kid short a few bucks. The way she clutched that bag, the way her voice trembled, this was bigger. Ron the cashier let out a slow, tired breath, the kind that wasn't meant to be rude but carried just enough impatience to sting. "Well," he said, tapping his fingers on the counter, "you'll have to put something back." The girl's face fell. She looked down at her bag, as if trying to decide which item was least important. But how do you choose between bread and milk when you need both? Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the soup cans, hesitating before setting one down. But even then, Snoop could see she still didn't have enough. Snoop felt that familiar pull in his chest, the kind that comes when you know you're watching something that ain't right. He'd seen struggle before. He knew what it looked like, and more importantly, he knew what it felt like. This little girl wasn't just running an errand. She was carrying the weight of something bigger. Without thinking twice, Snoop slid his shades down just a bit and stepped forward, his smooth voice breaking through the uncomfortable silence like a warm breeze on a cold day. "Ayo," Snoop said, his tone light but steady, "don't even trip, little lady. I got you." The girl froze, her eyes widening as she turned to look at him. For a moment, it was like she didn't recognize what was happening, like the words didn't make sense. But when she saw who was standing there, her jaw dropped slightly. It wasn't just any stranger offering to help. It was Snoop Dogg. The people in line behind her exchanged surprised glances. Even Ron the cashier raised an eyebrow, his bored expression flickering with a hint of recognition. You don't have to," the girl stammered, her voice soft and unsure. Her eyes darted around, like she wasn't sure if she should feel embarrassed or grateful, or maybe both. But Snoop just smiled, pulling out a crisp bill from his pocket and handing it to Ron. "Yeah," he said, his voice easy and cool, "but I want to." The girl's cheeks flushed, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. It was something else, relief. Gratitude. Maybe even disbelief. As the cashier took the money and bagged the groceries, the whole vibe of the store shifted. The impatience from the people in line melted into something softer. The woman in the business suit who'd been tapping her watch just moments ago now looked at Snoop with a mix of surprise and respect. Even the young man with the phone put it down, watching the scene unfold with a quiet kind of admiration. It wasn't just about buying groceries. It was about showing up when it mattered. As Ron handed over the bag, Snoop knelt down slightly, so he was eye level with the little girl. His voice softened, just enough that only she could hear. "You taking care of someone at home?" he asked gently. The girl hesitated, then nodded, her eyes dropping to the floor. "My mom's sick," she whispered. "She couldn't come out today, and we didn't have much left in the fridge." Snoop felt that familiar weight in his chest. He'd seen hard times, knew what it was like to feel like the world was on your shoulders when it shouldn't be. But he wasn't about to let this little girl carry it alone, not today. "Tell you what," Snoop said, standing back up and giving the cashier a nod. "We're gonna add a few more things to this bag." The girl's eyes widened again, but Snoop just winked. "Can't have you going home without some snacks too," he grinned. He grabbed a few more items, some fresh fruit, a bottle of juice, even a little candy for good measure. The girl tried to protest, her voice small and hesitant, but Snoop wasn't having it. "You gotta keep your strength up to take care of your mama, right?" he said, handing the now much heavier bag back to her. The girl clutched the bag tightly, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She tried to say thank you, but the words got stuck in her throat. Snoop just patted her gently on the shoulder. "You just keep being strong, all right," he said softly. "And tell your mama Snoop Dogg said to get well soon." And with that, the girl gave him one last smile, small, but full of gratitude, and hurried out the door, her heart a little lighter, and her burden a little less heavy. As the girl's trembling hands hovered over the can of soup she was about to put back, Snoop Dogg felt a quiet but powerful shift inside himself. He didn't think. He didn't weigh the situation. Some moments in life didn't need a second guess, they called for action. The air in the corner store felt thick, almost as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The girl's small voice, barely audible as she whispered apologies to the cashier, echoed louder in Snoop's mind than any beat that had ever played through his headphones. In that instant, Snoop knew he wasn't just watching a random moment. He was witnessing a struggle that went deeper than a missing dollar or two. This was about survival, about a kid trying to shoulder responsibilities no child should have to carry. Snoop took a slow, deliberate step forward. His sneakers made a soft sound against the worn linoleum floor, but in the silence of that moment, it felt like the loudest thing in the world. The people in line glanced at him, some recognizing him instantly, others just sensing his presence before realizing who was standing there. But Snoop wasn't doing it for attention. His eyes were locked on the little girl, her head bowed as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her small frame. As he reached into his pocket, pulling out a crisp bill, he spoke, not loudly, but with the kind of steady calm that made everyone listen. "Ayo," Snoop said, his smooth, deep voice cutting through the tension like a warm knife through butter. "Don't even trip, little lady. I got you." The words hung in the air for a beat before they sank in. The girl froze, her small shoulders stiffening as she slowly turned to look at him. Her wide, uncertain eyes met Snoop's calm, reassuring gaze, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Like it was no big deal. Like helping her was the most natural thing in the world. For a second, the girl didn't move. She didn't even blink. Her eyes scanned Snoop's face, then darted to the bill in his hand, as if trying to process what was happening. The recognition hit her like a wave, not just that someone was helping her, but who it was. You don't have to," she stammered, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and disbelief, and she clutched the plastic bag tighter against her chest. But Snoop just gave her a small, easy smile, the kind that made you feel like everything was gonna be all right. "Nah," Snoop said, shaking his head gently as he handed the bill to the cashier, "but I want to." His voice was casual, like he was talking to an old friend. But there was something in his tone that made it clear, this wasn't charity. This was respect. It was about seeing someone in need and stepping up without making a big show of it. The cashier, Ron, who had been impatient just moments ago, now seemed flustered, his eyes darting between Snoop and the girl as he quickly took the money. The mood in the store shifted instantly. The impatience that had been simmering in the line behind the girl evaporated, replaced by a quiet respect that filled the space like a warm light. The woman in the business suit, who had been tapping her foot just moments ago, now stood still, her expression softening. The young man with the phone lowered it, watching the scene unfold with a newfound awareness. It wasn't every day you saw something like this, not just kindness, but kindness from someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. As the cashier bagged the groceries, Snoop knelt down slightly so he could look the girl in the eye. His shades rested low on his nose, revealing a warmth in his gaze that few people ever got to see. "You taking care of someone at home?" he asked gently, his voice soft enough that only she could hear. The girl hesitated, her eyes dropping to the floor. She nodded slowly, her grip tightening on the bag. "My mom's sick," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She couldn't come out today, and we didn't have much left in the fridge." Snoop felt a familiar pull in his chest, a deep connection to the struggle she was facing. He'd seen hard times. He knew what it was like to carry a weight that felt too heavy, especially when you were too young to bear it. Snoop stood back up, his mind made up before the girl could say another word. He turned to the cashier, his voice carrying just enough authority to make it clear there was no room for argument. "Yo, we're gonna add a few more things to this bag," he said, already reaching for the shelves. The girl's eyes widened, her mouth opening to protest, but Snoop held up a hand, cutting her off with a gentle smile. "Can't have you going home without something extra," he said, grabbing some fresh fruit, a bottle of juice, and even a little candy for good measure. The girl's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't from stress or fear. They were from relief. As Snoop handed the now much heavier bag back to the girl, he gave her a reassuring nod. "You gotta keep your strength up to take care of your mama, right?" he said, his voice soft but steady. The girl nodded, her small hands gripping the bag tightly. She tried to find the words to thank him, but they got stuck in her throat, the weight of the moment too much to express. But Snoop didn't need to hear it. He could see it in her eyes. You just keep being strong, all right? Snoop said softly, patting her gently on the shoulder. And tell your mama Snoop Dogg said to get well soon. With that, the girl gave him one last look, a mix of gratitude and awe, and hurried out the door, her heart lighter, her burden eased, if only for a little while. As the door jingled shut behind her, the store slowly returned to life, but the vibe had changed. People whispered quietly, exchanging glances, but the respect in the room was undeniable. Snoop paid for his own items, slipped his shades back on, and walked out into the sun, his usual cool swagger in place. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just another errand. Because sometimes, it's the smallest moments that leave the biggest mark. And for Snoop Dogg, making a difference didn't need an audience. It just needed heart. As the cashier slid the girl's modest groceries into a thin plastic bag, Snoop Dogg felt a deeper sense of responsibility settle in his chest. It wasn't just about covering the cost of a few missing dollars, it was about easing the burden that hung in the air around this little girl, a weight too heavy for such small shoulders. Snoop had seen that look before. It wasn't just about being short on cash. It was about knowing there was someone waiting at home who needed you, someone counting on you to come through. The girl's hesitant glance toward the door, the way her fingers gripped the bag like it was a lifeline, Snoop knew there was more to the story. And he wasn't about to let her leave with just the bare minimum. Snoop reached for the bag before the cashier could hand it to the girl, his smooth voice cutting through the lingering tension. "Hold up," he said, flashing a reassuring smile at the girl. "We ain't done yet." The girl blinked up at him, confusion flickering in her wide eyes. What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice still carrying that tremble from before. Snoop tilted his head toward the shelves, his grin widening just enough to soften the seriousness of the moment. "We're gonna add a few more things," he said casually, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. The girl shook her head quickly, her small hands waving as if to stop him. "You don't have to," she said, her voice rushed and panicked. "This is already too much." But Snoop raised an eyebrow, his laid-back charm shining through. "Nah," he said smoothly, "but I want to." His words weren't just kind, they were final. There was no room for argument in his tone, no space for the girl to feel guilty about the generosity. "You gotta eat more than bread and soup," Snoop added, glancing at the nearly empty bag. "Ain't nobody staying strong on that." As Snoop turned toward the shelves, the entire store seemed to hold its breath. The woman in the business suit, who had been impatient just moments ago, now stood quietly, her arms crossed as she watched the scene unfold. The young man with the phone had long since put it away, his eyes fixed on Snoop, the kind of quiet admiration building that didn't need words. Even the cashier, Ron, who had started the interaction with indifference, now stood motionless behind the counter, his hands resting on the register as if he knew this wasn't just another transaction. Snoop didn't need an audience. But the people in that store were witnessing something rare, genuine kindness without fanfare, without expectation. Snoop moved down the narrow aisles with purpose, grabbing items off the shelves with a practiced ease. A carton of fresh eggs, a bag of oranges, a bottle of juice, a loaf of wheat bread to replace the white one. "Gotta keep it healthy," he mumbled to himself, tossing in a few apples for good measure. The girl followed behind him, her small feet shuffling as she tried to keep up. She kept glancing nervously toward the door, as if expecting someone to burst in and tell her this was all a dream. Snoop noticed. "You ain't dreamin', lil' lady," he said over his shoulder, his tone light but warm. "This is real life." After stocking up on the basics, Snoop paused by the candy aisle. He glanced down at the girl, who was staring at the colorful wrappers with a mix of longing and guilt. "You like chocolate?" he asked, already knowing the answer. The girl's eyes widened, but she quickly shook her head. "No, it's okay," she whispered. "We don't need that." Snoop chuckled, his deep, smooth laugh filling the small store. "Sometimes, you do need that," he said, grabbing a couple of candy bars and tossing them into the basket. "A little sweetness goes a long way." The girl's lips curled into a shy smile, the first genuine one he'd seen from her since this whole thing started. When they returned to the counter, the cashier was still standing there, his posture slightly more relaxed, but his eyes filled with something that looked a lot like respect. Snoop placed the additional items on the conveyor belt, giving Ron a small nod. "Ring it all up," he said simply. Ron hesitated for a moment, then quickly got to work, scanning the items with more care than before. The girl stood quietly beside Snoop, her hands now resting on the growing pile of groceries, her eyes wide with disbelief. She tried to speak, but Snoop gave her a knowing look. "Ain't no need for words," he said softly. "Just take care of your mama, all right?" When everything was bagged up, Snoop handed the bags to the girl, making sure they were balanced just right so she could carry them comfortably. "Here," he said, pressing a little extra cash into her hand before she could protest. "For next time." The girl stared at the money, her eyes filling with tears. But Snoop wasn't looking for gratitude. He just wanted to make sure she had what she needed. "You keep your head up, all right," he said, giving her shoulder a gentle pat. "You're doing good." As the girl turned to leave, she paused at the door, her small frame silhouetted against the fading sunlight outside. She looked back at Snoop, her voice trembling but filled with a strength he hadn't heard before. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes locking onto his. "I won't forget this." Snoop smiled, his heart full in a way that no amount of fame or fortune could ever match. "You don't gotta," he said quietly. "Just pass it on when you can." As the door jingled shut behind her, the store slowly came back to life, but the vibe had changed. The woman in the business suit gave Snoop a respectful nod as she passed, the young man with the phone whispered something to his friend, and even Ron the cashier gave a small, appreciative smile. Snoop paid for his own things, slipped his shades back on, and walked out into the cool evening air, his usual smooth stride carrying him down the street. But in his heart, he knew this wasn't just another day. Because sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness leave the biggest marks. And for Snoop Dogg, making a difference didn't need an audience, it just needed heart. The girl clutched the bags tightly to her chest, her small arms straining under the unexpected weight of the extra food. It wasn't just the physical load that made her tremble slightly, it was the emotional weight of what had just happened. She hadn't expected help. She hadn't even asked for it. But now, here she was, holding more than just groceries. She was holding a moment she would never forget. Her eyes flicked up to Snoop, trying to find the right words, but they caught in her throat, tangled in a mess of gratitude, disbelief, and something else, hope. Snoop noticed her struggle. He'd seen it before in other faces, in other places. That look of someone trying to figure out why a stranger would care enough to help. "You don't gotta say nothing," Snoop said softly, his voice like a warm breeze cutting through the cool air of the store. "Just take care of your mama, all right?" The girl nodded quickly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But Snoop wasn't looking for tears. He wasn't looking for gratitude. He was looking to make sure she knew one thing: she mattered. As Snoop and the girl stood there, the store seemed to hold its breath all over again. The hum of the refrigerator in the back, the distant creak of the old ceiling fan, it all faded into the background. Everyone was watching, but no one was speaking. The woman in the business suit had lowered her phone, the young man who'd been scrolling earlier stood still, and even Ron the cashier seemed frozen in place, his eyes locked on the simple, powerful moment unfolding before him. But Snoop wasn't performing for an audience. His attention was solely on the girl in front of him. The girl shifted her weight from one foot to the other, still clutching the bags tightly, as if letting go of them would somehow make the moment disappear. She opened her mouth to say something again, but Snoop gently shook his head, his smile soft but firm. "Nah," he said, his voice smooth and steady. "Ain't no need for all that. Just keep being strong." Her lips quivered, but she nodded again, her small frame relaxing just a little. Before she could turn to leave, Snoop reached into his pocket and pulled out another bill, folding it neatly and slipping it into the front pocket of her hoodie. "For next time," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. The girl's eyes widened, and for a second, she looked like she might protest. But one look at Snoop's calm, unwavering gaze, and she understood this wasn't about pity. This was about making sure she had what she needed. "You know," Snoop said quietly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "sometimes life throws you a curveball. But you keep swinging, all right? You don't stop just 'cause it gets tough." The girl nodded, her grip tightening on the bags again. But this time, it wasn't out of fear or uncertainty. It was out of determination. She wasn't just carrying groceries anymore. She was carrying a lesson, a memory, a moment of kindness that would stay with her long after the weight of the food was gone. As the girl turned to leave, the store remained silent. The usual noises, the beep of the register, the shuffle of feet, the rustle of plastic bags, felt distant, irrelevant. The woman in the business suit watched the girl with a softened expression, her earlier impatience forgotten. The young man who had been scrolling now stood with his arms crossed, nodding slightly as if silently acknowledging the power of what he had just witnessed. Even Ron, the cashier who had started the day indifferent and distant, seemed to stand a little straighter behind the counter, his eyes lingering on Snoop with a newfound respect. Just as the girl reached the door, she paused, her small frame silhouetted against the fading light outside. She turned back, her eyes locking onto Snoop's one last time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice steady this time, filled with more strength than before. "I won't forget this." Snoop nodded, his expression soft but serious. "You don't gotta," he replied. "Just pass it on when you can." As the girl disappeared down the street, the weight of the moment lingered in the store. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore, it felt meaningful. The woman in the business suit gave Snoop a subtle nod as she passed by, her earlier rush forgotten. The young man near the door clapped him gently on the shoulder as he left, a silent gesture of respect. Even Ron, still behind the counter, gave a small, appreciative smile as he rang up Snoop's items, the tension between them replaced with a quiet understanding. Snoop paid for his own things, slid his shades back onto his face, and walked out into the cool evening air. His usual smooth stride carried him down the street, but his heart felt lighter, fuller. He hadn't done it for recognition. He hadn't done it to make a scene. He'd done it because he knew that sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness leave the biggest marks. And for Snoop Dogg, making a difference didn't require a stage, it just needed heart. As Snoop stepped out of the corner store, the cool evening air brushed against his face, but his mind lingered on the little girl walking down the street with her heavy bags. He watched her for a moment, her small figure blending into the city's rhythm, but now carrying something more than groceries, she carried a little hope. Inside the store, the atmosphere had shifted. The impatient customers had softened, and the cashier who barely looked up before now nodded at Snoop with quiet respect. The woman in the business suit even held the door open for the next person, her demeanor calmer, less rushed. Snoop didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. Walking back down the familiar streets of Long Beach, Snoop Dogg didn't think of what he'd done as anything extraordinary. To him, it was just the right thing to do. But he knew moments like that could change the course of someone's day, or even their life. Because sometimes, a small gesture isn't just about filling a grocery bag. It's about reminding someone they're seen, they matter, and that the world isn't